The first couple weeks of class, we will cover the very bare rudiments of ancient Greek history. The general trajectory of this history charts the recovery of an impoverished and largely ignored people to become a colonial power that will eventually export its language and its culture throughout the known world. We know a lot about how this happens. Why is a bit trickier of a question to answer, and I don't claim to have easy explanations. This is the Greek homeland. One noteworthy feature of the geography of this place that does a lot to shape its history is how mountainous it is. There is some arable land, but not much. Populations of the Greek mainland and islands could find it difficult to feed themselves, and summers are so dry that enough water to drink was and remains a problem in Greece. The Indo-European speakers of the language that became Greece settled in the Balkan Peninsula in about 1600 BCE. The civilization that they developed came to center around economic and political centers of power that we usually, just for the sake of convenience, call palaces. These people, whom we call the Mycenaeans, established trade relations all throughout the Mediterranean Sea and also seem to have become involved in some foreign wars, which may have been the origins of the myths of the war for Troy. We can say a bit about the economic activities of the palaces because their bureaucrats adapted a writing system from the nearby Minoans in Crete and kept written inventories in a script that we call Linear B. Now that we know that Linear B is just an early stratum of the Greek language written by the ancestors of the historical Greeks, we can read them. The Mycenaeans engaged in some pretty impressive building projects, like the Gate of Mycenae, shown here. Many of these buildings survived for later Greeks to admire, and some still survive today. When the ancient Greeks told myths and stories about the Achaeans, or the Greek heroes like Heracles and Achilles, they believed they were telling stories about their ancestors, the Mycenaeans. It is one of the great mysteries of Greek history. We do not know how the Mycenaean society suffered a collapse, only that it did around 1100 BCE. We know that these people were not alone, but that there was a massive upheaval in the whole eastern Mediterranean basin, with refugees tending to flee south. Some of these refugees were Mycenaeans, and we are pretty sure that the settlers of Palestine, whom the Old Testament calls the Philistines, were the descendants of Mycenaean settlers. Back in Greece, all we can say for sure is that the palaces were abandoned. What writing existed was forgotten, and the population plummeted. The next 200 to 300 years of the early Iron Age is sometimes called the Dark Age of ancient Greece. We know very little about it. One thing we do know is that the population increases gradually, and people on the Greek mainland begin to settle some of the Aegean islands to the east of Greece. And then they settle over much of the western coast of Turkey. The Greeks certainly begin making ties with other peoples, most notably the Phoenicians. When we turn to later history that we know a little bit more about, we have to break it up into manageable phases in order to have coherent narratives that we can tell and understand in a manageable amount of time. We call this breaking up of history periodizing, that is, identifying different periods of history. It is usual to talk about three periods of Greek history after the Dark Age: the Archaic period, the Classical period, and the Hellenistic period. It is important to remember that this periodizing is only a tool that we contrive and use for our convenience. The Greeks themselves of the year 320 BCE did not think of themselves as Hellenistic in contrast to those classical Greeks who lived 4 years earlier. We break this history up into periods only because it makes the history easier for us to talk about. The terms archaic, classical, and Hellenistic were actually originally used to refer to different artistic styles in use at different times in Greek history. But modern historians have come to expand the artistic terminology to refer to political history as well. On this slide, we can see some of the art that characterizes the Archaic period in particular. The figures are made very skillfully, but are idealized and also stylized. There's something just slightly cartoonish about them. They don't quite look lifelike. The most convenient point at which to start talking about Greek history proper is the invention, or rather rediscovery, of writing. In about 700 BCE, the Greeks adopted the script of the Phoenician peoples and adapted it to their own language, creating the Greek alphabet, shown here. Now, the Phoenician writing system was a little bit different. It spelled words with only, wrote only the consonants of words, leaving the vowels understood by the reader, who was a fluent speaker of the language, presumably, and wouldn't have trouble. One innovation that the Greeks made in their writing system over the Phoenicians is that they added letters or symbols for the vowel sounds, giving Greek the distinction of possibly being the first true alphabet, with one letter written to represent one sound in a word. When the Greeks invented their writing system, they did not begin recording history as we know it, unfortunately. Mostly, they recorded their songs and poems insofar as we can tell, some of which we can still read today, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, though most archaic literature is only available to us in fragments. The specific details of who did what may be mostly lost to us, but we can speak in broad terms about important social developments in the Archaic period, one of which we call the rise of the polis. Polis is the ancient Greek word for city-state, not just what we call a city, an urban center, but a fully independent local territory around an urban center that governs itself. With the polis comes the concept of citizenship. Who is entitled to participate in politics, who is entitled to the protections of the people's law, and who is not. The process is gradual, but we can say with some confidence that during the Archaic period, the polis-centered concept of citizenship comes to replace the earlier clan-based feuding culture of the early Iron Age, or Dark Age of Greece. Pictured here are the three main topographical features of a polis. Most polis is plural of polis, congregate around an acropolis, a higher point of land to which people can retreat and defend themselves if they are attacked. Some acropolis are very impressive peaks, like at Athens or Corinth. Some, like at Sparta, are barely hills. It all depends upon what the terrain has to offer in a particular area. Around the Acropolis springs up the osti, or the town, the more densely populated urban center, and around the osti is the chora, the countryside, where the people's food is largely grown. One point of controversy about early Greece is whether all the farmland was monopolized by the wealthy, or whether there was a growing middle class of freeholders. We cannot say for certain yet. The hypothetical polis shown here, you will notice, has a harbor. Most Greeks lived near the sea, and fewer of them lived inland, especially in the mountains. The inland generally had less farmland and was very difficult to get around on foot. The most convenient way to travel from one place to another in Greece was usually by ship, skirting the coast from one harbor to another. There were exceptions, of course. Another thing we can say about the Archaic period is that it was a time of colonization. As the population of the Greek mainland increased, the land's ability to feed the people was stretched. Greeks usually dealt with this problem in the Archaic period by sending their excess population, generally their excess men, to found new polis outside of Greece, sometimes very far away or impressively far away. The Greeks who settled in southern Italy, and especially Sicily, became very wealthy. There were prominent Greek settlements on the coast of Spain and France, like the Greek colony of Massilia, which became the modern French city of Marseille. And there were Greek polis that sprang up around the Black Sea, where farmland was plentiful. These Greeks sold their grain to the hungry Greek mainland. The Greeks would not be able to avoid interference from outside powers for long, it is clear.